call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 24 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Conformément à règlement 100.
Pursuant to Standing Order 108-2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, February 12th, 2026, the committee is meeting on the humanitarian crisis in Cuba.
Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'd also like to ask all in-person participants to consult the guidelines on the cards on the table. These measures are in place to protect the health and safety of both the participants and the interpreters. Please note that today's meeting is taking place exceptionally with interpretation services in Spanish in addition to the two official languages. We would like to thank the team of interpreters who are with us today. Members and witnesses simply need to select the appropriate channel on the console located on the seat in the room or through the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few more comments. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking, and a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. For members in the room, if you wish to speak, please raise your hand. For members on Zoom, please use the raised hand function. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the first hour. From the Cuban Canadians Coalition, Kirena Carbonell, Public Relations Director, as well as Raimet Martinez, President, and David Medeiros, Member. From Citizens and Freedom, Carolina Barrero Ferrer, President and Chief Executive Officer by video conference. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we'll proceed with rounds of questions. I now invite Kirena Carbonell, Public Relations Director of the Cuban Canadians Coalition, to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Bienvenido.
Gracias. Mr. Chair, honorable members of the committee, thank you for this invitation. My name is Kirena Carbonell, representing the Cuban Canadian Coalition. I am here to present evidence of a multidimensional collapse. Cuba is currently enduring its most severe humanitarian and economic crisis in modern history. This is not merely an opinion. It is verifiable through official statistics, independent analysis, and the lived reality of millions. On the myth of the external causality, let me be clear. This crisis is not a recent byproduct of external policy. Cuba's structural collapse predates recent sanctions. Between 2020 and 2024, GDP contracted by over 15%. This is a stagnant, unproductive economy by design. Agricultural production has plummeted, forcing a fertile island to import most of its food. Inflation has reached triple digits, meaning salaries and pensions no longer cover basic nutrition. These are the results of domestic policy decisions and centralized mismanagement, not foreign intervention. On demographic and energy collapse, the human cost is staggering. Since 2022, over 500,000 Cubans, roughly 5% of the population, have fled to the United States alone. This is an unprecedented demographic hemorrhage in a peacetime. Compounding this is a total energy failure. While the regime blames fuel shortages, the truth is decades of neglect. Cuba's thermoelectric plants are over 40 to 50 years old. No large-scale modernization has occurred since the 1990s. While citizens suffer blackouts of up to 22 hours a day, the regime has prioritized high-end hotel construction over the national power grid. On health and misplaced priorities, the public health system, once the regime's flagship, has disintegrated. There is a critical shortage of basic medicines and surgical supplies. Official investment data reveals a chilling reality. The regime allocates 14 to 15 times more capital to tourism infrastructure than to healthcare. These are not anecdotes. They are budgetary choices. While children lack antibiotics, military-run conglomerates like Gaesa continue to expand luxury hotel portfolios and dollar-only retail chains. On repression and political prisoners, economic failure is inseparable from political repression. Since the peaceful protests of July 11, 2021, the regime has imprisoned over 1,000 political prisoners, including artists, journalists, academics, and minors. Humanitarian aid cannot be effectively managed in a country where civil society is criminalized, and aid distribution is monopolized by the very structures responsible for the crisis. Therefore, our recommendations to Canada. Canada's long-standing engagement with Cuba provides both leverage and responsibility. We respectfully urge the Government of Canada to direct aid, support humanitarian assistance exclusively through independent, faith-based, and civil society channels. Advocacy, call consistently for the unconditional release of all political prisoners. Accountability, ensure that Canadian engagement and trade do not benefit military-controlled entities. Support, increase protection for independent journalists and human rights defenders. In conclusion, Canada must stand with the Cuban people, not by legitimizing a repressing status quo, but by aligning policy with transparency, accountability, and human dignity. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Thank you very much. I now invite Ms. Barrero Ferrer to make an opening statement. Sorry, Ms. Carolina Barrer.
Honorable Presidente.
Honorable Chair of the Committee and distinguished members, it is an honor to appear before this institution whose tradition of democratic rigor and commitment to international law represents precisely what millions of Cubans have given up their freedom for, and many of them their lives. Allow me to begin by framing what the committee has called a humanitarian crisis with the conceptual precision that is required for rigorous political analysis. What Cuba is suffering is not a crisis in the technical sense of the term. A crisis, by definition, is a temporary breakdown of a pre-existing order. What Cuba is going through right now is qualitatively different. It is the structural, systematic, and sustained result of a model of a governance that has subordinated the well-being of the population to the preservation of the power of a military and family elite. The blackouts that have recently come to the attention of international media and opinion are not merely the product of scarcity, but the result of prioritization. For years, Cuba has received oil at preferential prices or for free from Venezuela, Mexico, and Russia. More than 60% of that supply was sold to China and other countries, while Cubans were plunged into darkness. Power plants operated with obsolete components, and the electrical grid collapsed due to lack of maintenance. At this very moment, as we meet, a toxic cloud covers Havana. Garbage has been burning for more than a week without prior sorting or health protocols. Plastics, chemical compounds, and highly toxic materials are burning throughout the city. The toxic smoke is being breathed in by children, the elderly, and the sick. These are people who cannot demand protection because exercising the right to complain, even on social media, is sufficient cause for arbitrary detention, degrading treatment, and judicial condemnation without due process. The cases of Ernesto Ricardo, Camille Zayas, Angelis Guerra, and Sulmira Martinez, who were sentenced to 5 years of imprisonment for posting content on social media, are just some of the most recent examples. In light of this situation, I would like to draw your attention to a fact that economic analysis cannot overlook. Gaesa, G-A-E-S-A, the business conglomerate controlled by the armed forces, recorded $18.5 billion in cash on its 2024 balance sheet, $18.5 billion In a country with no medicines in its hospitals, with schools that are falling apart, with a collapsed health infrastructure, while the K-Tower hotel stands as an unequivocal monument to the structural inequality that sustains the system, accumulation at the top and abject poverty at the bottom. It is estimated that over the last 15 years, new hotels have been built by GAESA to the tune of 24 billion. With half of that, it would have been possible to refurbish the national electrical grid. But it is not the priority of the oppressive regime and the corrupt regime to truly take care of the best interests of the Cuban people. So I would like to now make 3 recommendations respectfully to the committee. So first, all bilateral relationships with Cuba that does not have the explicit condition of protecting the civil and political rights of Cubans helps to sustain the regime that caused the crisis that we are discussing today. When there is humanitarian aid without conditions that is provided to a regime that uses scarcity to maintain the population in misery is a terrible thing. Also, Canada has the authority and the institutional tools that are necessary to ensure sanctions against the officials who are responsible for severe human rights violations. The principle of individual responsibility that is enshrined in international law makes it possible for that kind of responsibility to be brought to the fore. Also, the unconditional freeing of political prisoners must be a non-negotiable prerequisite for any bilateral relationship between Canada and Cuba. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cuban people is not asking the world to solve its problems. It is asking the world to stop legitimating those who have caused the problem. History will judge democracies not only for what they have built, but for what they consented to when they had the moral authority and the institutional tools to be able to do something different. This committee has that authority, and it has that opportunity. I ask you to please act consequently. Thank you.
Remarks. I will now open the floor for questions, beginning with MP Rood. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses for those very touching testimonies in your opening remarks. It's been 67 years of communist rule and Cuba is in the midst of its worst humanitarian crisis since the special period. Why do you believe the government's centralized economic mismanagement, not external factors, is the primary driver of the shortages of food, medicine, electricity, and clean water that ordinary Cubans aren't suffering today? And I know you touched a little bit on it in your opening statement, so go ahead.
Thank you for your question. I would like to start by saying that the current regime utilizes hunger as a control tool. And therefore, as I was saying, they were able to invest in over 400 luxury hotels in Cuba. There are around 400, some of them 4-star, 5-star hotels. And while they keep building those hotels and while the supply chain miraculously is not affected to keep those hotels stocked, then the Cuban population lack the basics. However, I would like to highlight that this did not start on January. We have been for decades suffering from hunger. It is estimated that 89% of the population lives on extreme poverty. You see, we have what we call in Canada convenience stores, like bodegas. Each town might have one. Those shelves have been empty since I can remember. We do have pharmacies, we do have clinics, and due to the, I was saying, the immigration crisis, not only we are lacking medicine, we are also lacking the specialists, because Cuba exports specialists on the health sector, and what they are doing actually is contributing to modern slavery. Because while those countries pay the government a salary for the specialists, the government retains their passports, retain their salaries, and only pay a percentage of what the actually salaries are. And that salary gets retained in Havana. It's not provided the whole of it to the health personnel in those missions. So basically, it is their way to keep control of the population. It is because imagine, even here in Canada, over 60% of the population will be interested in political affairs. In Cuba, people are interested to know what is going to be the next meal. Mothers do not have time to invest themselves into politics. And you know, those mothers that are brave, that right now are behind bars, at one point we had over 97 women behind bars for expressing themselves, for taking to the street pacifically. They are occupied with trying to find out where they can find another glass of milk for their children. So I do know that the reality is so dark that it's hard to put into words what our Cuban people are going through. However, I'm doing my best to depict the reality on the island.
Thank you for that. Ms. Barrero, you alluded to this in your remarks. Leaked secret records show Cuba's military conglomerate, Gaeza, is sitting on up to $18 billion in cash reserves in dollar accounts, money from tourism, retail, and ports controlled by the Revolutionary Armed Forces, while ordinary Cubans endure the daily blackouts, they dig through garbage for food, and die from lack of basic medicine, as you've said. So in your view, doesn't this prove that the humanitarian crisis is caused by 67 years of corrupt communist mismanagement and elite hoarding and not external factors?
Gaesa, para quienes no lo sepan.
For those who may not know, Gaesa is the military business that controls 60% of the economy and almost 90% of the finances for all of Cuba. So it's a business conglomerate that is directly controlled by the armed forces and by the Castro family. In 2024, in its financial statements, it's shown that they had up to $18.5 billion in cash reserves. That's a sufficient reserve to solve a great number of the difficulties that Cuba is experiencing right now in the humanitarian crisis. And so that shows definitively what the priorities of the regime have been, and that is not the well-being of the Cuban people. The other thing that it shows is that there have been a number of initiatives to provide humanitarian aid to Cuba over the years, and most of them get resold to the population. It happened with mattresses. We've heard reports of people who had to buy some mattresses that had arrived into the country for free, and they had to buy them using hard currency. And so we know as well that there are things that are coming from Europe as well, and they're sent to rural areas, but they are saying that they are receiving that humanitarian aid, but they have to pay for it. So we have very clear evidence and proof, because we see hundreds of hotels that are where there are all kinds of vacancies, but money is not getting invested elsewhere. A lot of countries like Canada send many tourists to Cuba, but the hotels are empty. And what the regime does is keep building more and more hotels. Why and for whom? If those hotel rooms are empty, the regime should build hospitals and schools. And when we say that the regime is the structural cause of the crisis in Cuba, it's because if the regime really wanted to take care of people, it could have used the resources that it has had over these 60 or more years, almost 70 years. And we have seen that that is not the interest of the regime, because, as my colleague was saying, the regime wants people who is hungry to be able to control them.
Next colleague, Stephen Guilbeault, you have 6 minutes.
Monsieur le Président, thank you very much for being here with us. As you know, Foreign Affairs Minister Annan announced yesterday $8.3 million of aid to Cuba, which is roughly a doubling of what Canada has sent towards the country on a yearly basis. How is Canada's humanitarian assistance, particularly funding that's directed to the World Food Program, UNICEF, or the Red Cross, can be used on the ground to support vulnerable Cubans?
Thank you for the question. I would like to start by saying that we are very grateful for every time Canada, as the government, and also Canadians, try to help the Cuban population. What is concerning in this case is two things. I will give you my point of view from the Cuban perspective and also from the Canadian perspective. From the Cuban perspective, we do know that, for example, the $8.3 million will go to the organizations that you just mentioned. What we're worried about is who those organizations are partnering with within Cuba, because the government has a record to portraying few non-governmental organizations, Federación de Mujeres Cubanas, Central de Trabajadores.
The Federation of Cuban Women, Workers of Cuba.
Organization, although the regime portrays as independent, they are not. They are part of the structural failure that we are enduring. So rather than asking Canada to refrain from sending aid, what I would ask is that that aid is being distributed by, let's say, a faith-based institution that is distributed by the civil society, because the regime is going to divert, like Ms. Barrero was saying, is going to divert those. There are evidence of tourists in Cuba finding some of those packages that have been sent in the past in the hotel. So it does not reach the population. I've lived the island for 23 years. I keep in touch with my family. I come from the Holguin province. Canada has been helping Cuba for decades. None in my family, none in our province has received that help. So we do come here with concerns, but we are also offering solutions. We can distribute to the committee later via separate correspondence those point of contacts within Cuba that are willing and capable. They have the human resources, they have the capability to distribute the aid throughout the island. We do have confirmation from Caritas in Havana that they do not have capacity at the moment to distribute any help, because the U.S. administration has been providing aid to Cuba, and also the representative from the U.S. has been actually visiting provinces and speaking directly to the people to ensure and to have accountability and verification process to make sure it reaches the people. So I would also suggest that Canada does the same, should Canada wish. Thank you.
Thank you. So your suggestion is that rather than work with organizations like the ones I mentioned, the Red Cross, UNICEF, or the World Food Program, that we work with faith-based organizations. I believe we already do some of that, but you're suggesting we should refrain from working with UN agencies?
No, that's not what I'm referring to. No, Canada will work with the partnerships that are already established. I'm saying those partnerships in return, should they be willing to do so, we can provide the point of contacts of the civil society so that the help actually reaches the people. Because you see, should UNICEF or the World Program, the World Food, the World Food Program distribute the help with the Cuban partnership, political prisoners and the family of political prisoners won't see that. We have from the coalition sent medicine to Cuba, and I'll tell you a story quickly. The medicine that we have sent for children that were sick in Havana with high fever. The mother didn't have a thermometer to take the fever. We sent a package. They deployed 3 police cars to the residence of the person that was in charge of collecting the medicine and distributed among the several children of political prisoners. That's the reality in Cuba. Therefore, it's going to happen the same to the aid that Canada is sending. And the other thing I wanted to add, please, if I may, if Canada sends dollars to Cuba, funding, financial aid, for those partnerships within the island, they will have to end up in the retail dollarized stores that belong to the regime. So might as well send the $8.3 million directly to GAESA's funds. And from the Canadian point of view that I mentioned earlier, life in Canada is hard. Inflation in Canada has gone up to 7.1%. Why would taxpayers' money be funding a military dictatorship that has over $18 billion in assets? That I do not comprehend. Versus maybe engaging in dialogue, but firm dialogue, saying there needs to be reform in Cuba after 67 years. There need to be elections. There need to be a peaceful transition to democracy. We would love to see that from Canada. We should not continue as a country to funnel financial assistance to a dictatorship that is not budging. They don't want to democratize the island. They don't want to implement reforms for the free enterprise. Why Cuba has to have Canadian companies investing in our island? We Cubans cannot do that. Here in Canada, when we prepare the procurement paperwork, we do have to aim for 85 Canadian content in our paperwork and our procurements because we want to develop Canadian industry. And then why, if we want to do that as a country, then Cubans, we cannot develop our industry in Cuba? Why Canadian companies have to be enabling a regime to exploit its workers? Because again, that money, for example, Sherrit International, Sherrit has been polluted. My province, MOA, the municipality where Sherrit operates, is an environmental disaster. And Sherrit pays the funds to the Cuban government. They have employment agencies that collect the salary. And then the government keeps the salary and only pays a portion, and we don't have independent union. So Canadian companies are contributing to the slavery, modern slavery in Cuba.
Thank you very much. We're over, yeah. Monsieur Duceppe.
Mr. Duceppe, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, everyone, to the committee. I'll be speaking in French because my political party speaks French. Just to be sure, Ms. Carbonell, the money that was planned by Canada recently will go through the World Food Program and UNICEF. Did I understand correctly that you're saying that those organizations that are used to providing humanitarian assistance all over the globe would be unable to deliver that aid directly to people in Cuba?
Yes, we are suggesting, well, I cannot speak on how they operate on the ground. What I can speak to is for those organizations that you mentioned to coordinate with entities that are not part of the regime. The regime is creating the humanitarian crisis that we have right now. And like I said, aid provided to Cubans, is if they are in charge of distributing, is going to go to their military hospitals, is going to go to their mansions, and it's going to go to the elite in Cuba. It's going to go to the hotels. It's going to go to, there are about 35 enterprises under GAESA. Therefore, what we are suggesting is that the aid, which hopefully won't be in cash, hopefully it's not going to be Canadian funds, because otherwise they will end up in the regime stores to get it, because other stores in national currency, you see, Cubans they paid in the national currency. But to get the essentials, they have to end up in those stores that are only dollar. You can only, the currency at those stores is only dollars. So regardless, the funding is going to end up in the books of GAESA.
We'll see. It often comes with accountability. Those organizations are competent. We'll see if you're correct. I'd like to ask a question. In your view, is it possible to not have regime political ideals, but also not support international policies that would oppress a population? Is it possible to do those things at the same time? Not to have the regime's political ideals, but also not to support policies that directly affect the population?
Policies in Cuba, when it comes from the regime, when it comes from the government, policies in Cuba affect the population. There is not one policy in Cuba that does not affect the population. So,
I was talking about international policies, the U.S.
French and English is the...
I'll speak more softly. In terms of human rights, do not have the impression that American policy has had much more of an impact on the population rather than on the regime. That's how things have been for 67 years, and the regime is still in place. What we see currently is a humanitarian crisis, one of the worst that Cuba has ever had, and it's the people who are suffering. I have no judgment. I'm asking you the question. American policies currently, if I look at what's in place, the regime isn't falling, but the people are suffering. Wouldn't there be cause for concern there?
Thank you for the question. I understand what you mean. It is true that we have that reflex to, let's say, be concerned about the external policy from the U.S. administration. But the real cause of the suffering in Cuba is not external. Like I just said, the administration in Cuba is capable of running the repression and is capable of running resorts. Should they wish, they will be also able to run the healthcare, education system. However, they do not care. The Cuban regime does not care about the suffering of the people. You know, we are talking about a regime that yesterday should have said, we are not able to run this island. We have a centralized economy that is not working, and we're going to have democracy and we're going to have economic reforms. But they are in their corner blaming everybody else in their mother instead of having accountability and saying that it is their failed policies that have given us 67 years of dictatorship. For example, the regime is able to procure personal protective equipment from a NATO country. A NATO country like Spain, this is mind-baffling, a NATO country like Spain has procured full operational gear to the Cuban forces when they know that those forces are deployed against the unarmed civilian population when we take to the street to demand freedom, when they know that those forces are deployed to Venezuela to be the first inner circle of Maduro narco-terrorist regime, and then they tell the world in UN Assembly, they come here to Canada, to this house, to spout lies, and they tell the world that no Cuban troops are in Ukraine, that no Cuban troops are in Venezuela, and then they return to Cuba in shoe boxes, and the world sees that they're lying.
Monsieur Duceppe, Madame Ferrer.
Ms. Barreto would like to respond to your question.
Go ahead, Madame Ferrer.
Gracias.
Thank you. Yes, I'd like to respond to the question very clearly. The answer is no. American sanctions are not the cause of the crisis, the humanitarian crisis. I will explain why. First, there's no blockade. It hasn't existed in those 67 years. What we have is a series of sanctions. They're rather complex, but the only thing they affect is the capacity of the regime to ask for funding from North American banks. Why would the Cuban regime want to ask for funding from the banks of imperialism? Nevertheless, Cuba buys food and medicine from the United States. The United States is number 5 in terms of trade with Cuba, with food. If I may conclude, please. Thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I will be interrupted. I can't conclude answering.
We next go to MP Cobena. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Bueno, primero que nada.
First, I'd like to thank all of the witnesses, Carolina as well. I understand that it must be very difficult to speak about the difficulties your country is going through right now. Before I begin my questions, I'd like to give Carolina the opportunity to conclude her answer to the previous question. Thank you. Very kind of you. It's not just the 5th largest exporter of food and medicine. It has...
Interrupt. If you can slow down your pace just for the benefit of the interpreters, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Con mucho gusto.
Yes, with pleasure. If I'm not interrupted, well, I wasn't sure how to proceed. Thank you. I'll have another question. Would none of you call into question the sanctions that European countries have put in place against Vladimir Putin or Lukashenko in Belarus? Why exempt the Cuban military and those responsible for human rights violations, those who are allies with Putin, who've sent mercenaries to the war? Why let them off the hook? Why not sanction them? There are Magnitsky individual sanctions that could be applied and are used around the world. Why exempt Cubans from that? It's a taboo?
Esa es mi respuesta.
That's my answer. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carolina. In 1 minute, could you share with the committee a clear vision of the humanitarian situation currently in Cuba, especially in terms of access to food, medicine, electricity, and basic public services. And how have those conditions evolved in the past few years? Yes. The crisis in Cuba is only comparable to Haiti. In Cuba, nothing is working. Services aren't provided to the public. No education, health, transportation. Cities are not working. The only thing working is oppression. To give you an idea, if a person has a heart attack and calls an ambulance, the ambulance will arrive maybe in 8 hours or not at all. If you complain or have a protest, if you call for freedom, you say down with the dictatorship in the street, 4 patrol cars will be at your door within 15 minutes, and you will be a prisoner. There's gas for that. Services are available for that. So this is a country where the only thing working is oppression. Citizens don't have the right to complain. A Facebook post can have you end up in prison. That has happened with youth currently. And the only thing the state does, the regime does, is present itself as a victim. It's not accountable to citizens. It doesn't take on its responsibilities for the poor management. It's more than inefficiency. It's about the priorities they've set. They've prioritized other things that haven't been taking care of the people. They keep asking for help to continue justifying themselves, to enrich themselves, because this is a regime that is very corrupt, that has stolen, and there's evidence that they've stolen humanitarian aid.
Gracias, Carolina.
Thank you, Carolina. Can you share what caused the current humanitarian crisis in Cuba? Yes, as I was saying, more than a crisis, it's systemic. It's part of the structure. What's happening now is caused by the essence of the Castro regime over 60 years. If you've never taken care of power plants in 30 years, the components can't be repaired because those components aren't sold anymore. Since the 80s, a lot of this electric system hasn't been maintained, but they were building hotels because they were not interested. That wasn't the regime's priority. So this is the end of a crisis due to structural conditions. Humanitarian aid is just like a Band-Aid, and it might provide a little bit of relief, but we need to look at the roots of the suffering of the Cuban people. You have to look at the cause, which is the nature of the regime. Canada has committed recently to provide $8.3 million in assistance to Cuba. Based on past experience, how is aid usually distributed within the country? It's distributed through organizations like UNICEF, the Red Cross, and other programs. What happens is that these organizations, which are established around the world and have accountability structures that have been proven, they work with organizations of the Cuban state, and those organizations respond to the Cuban regime, to the Castro family, and they end up redistributing that aid through other channels that are difficult to have accountability. And we've had a lot of reports that we can send to you. The aid ends up being resold, even to hotels, and they don't reach the population. So our suggestion is that you use the church, Caritas, and religious institutions that have the same capacity to be accountable internationally. They've shown that when they receive the aid on the ground, because UNICEF doesn't have the capacity to reach the people, or the Red Cross, not in Cuba anyway. It has to be done through organizations on the ground. So when it's been done with the church, it has worked.
We next go to MP Vandelbelt. You have 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. I want to thank both witnesses for the work that you're doing and for your testimony today. I think all of us, we all have constituents who are writing to us, and we're seeing the images coming out of Cuba, and there is a tremendous concern to help the people of Cuba and to provide some humanitarian assistance, as our government announced yesterday. I'm very interested in how Canada can use our assistance, both in terms of the long-term stability and helping the actual Cuban people, but also as leverage in order to get the sort of economic and governance reforms that you were talking about. And also, I just wanted to get a little bit of clarification because I've worked with UN agencies, and often the way that they, just to reassure you, Canadian aid typically isn't in goods or cash. Often it'll be the World Food Program that will work with communities directly with women, help them to purchase agricultural goods and then have them cook the goods and then be able to distribute. So I just wonder if there can be a little bit of, we want to make sure our aid gets to the right place. I mean, I think that's what all of us want. We heard this week that from our own officials that often it's going to things like renewable energy locally, or it's going to increasing yields for women agricultural producers and things like that. So if we could just, if you could clarify a little bit, because I don't want to have a message that we shouldn't be sending aid, but then how do we turn that around and use that to get the kinds of reforms and desirable outcomes that we're all looking for?
Thank you for the question. And I would like to appreciate also every Canadian that is worried about the situation in Cuba. A lot of our friends for over 20, 30 years are also worried. And you know what? Cubans, Canadians are also worried because even if we want to help our families, we have no way right now to do so. So that aside, I would like to highlight that we are not saying not to send aid, and we are not saying not to cooperate with people on the ground. We do understand Canada is principled when it comes to assisting humanitarian crisis, and it's not what we are saying. What we are saying is that while the regime representative came to this floor and said the things that he said, I recommend that this committee do not take that at face value, because they will paint a picture that they will have used those funds to construct this, to construct that. Please do not believe. The same afternoon, he was saying that the government, the regime in Cuba supports peace. There was a UN resolution being voted on, and while he was telling this chamber that the regime supports peace, they were voting no in the UN resolution for a peace in Ukraine. Like I say, they go to United Nations and they tell United Nations that military compulsory service in Cuba for teenagers is not obligatoire, is not mandatory. It is mandatory. In Holguin, there are 9 young people who lost their life because they sent teenagers to handle life ordnance. And they blew, and instead of recuperating the bodies, or instead of asking Canada for assistance to recuperate the bodies, they poured cement where those poor souls were blown up. So do not take what they say as the truth. We have, like I said, we won't reveal names here for the protection, but we can share with the committee via separate correspondence the name and the point of contact throughout Cuba in many, many provinces, except Havana, because like I said, in Havana, Caritas, for example, has so much help already that they have a human resource gap to distribute that help. So they were honest with us last week, and they said, even if you send us help right now, we cannot distribute it because we have so much to distribute, which is music to our ears. So should Canada like to distribute aid directly to the people, we are putting our hand up to help coordinate that distribution so it reaches good port. Thank you.
Ms. Barrero?
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. I would say the same thing. We have a humanitarian assistance program at Ciudadanos y Libertad, and we sent 1 ton of humanitarian assistance to Cuba. It's not a lot in the spectrum of humanitarian aid internationally, but for us it was a success because we do not want to abandon the Cubans who are on the island. and we help 50 families of political prisoners as well on a regular basis. So what we're saying is not to not send assistance, because we do it as an organization as well. But what we're saying is that we recommend that you either go through civil society to send your assistance, or if civil society can't do it, then you can do it through faith-based organizations or a combination of the two, because those are the channels that are proven to make sure that the aid gets to the people. Thank you.
Duceppe, vous avez...
Mr. Duceppe, you have 2 minutes, not 12 minutes. Ms. Ferrer, are you in contact with U.S. authorities to... Excuse me, I would like to speak, and I would like to start my time again because there's a lot of very loud talking around the table. Thank you. So, Ms. Ferrer, are you in contact with U.S. authorities to coordinate action to change the regime that is in place in Cuba right now?
Perdona que yo también.
I'm sorry, I have to laugh too. So I have contact with governments all over the world, European governments. I've been to a number of countries, and I have been welcomed at the Department of State, but I do not believe in violent action to overturn my country's regime, but I do work with a great deal of honor to make sure that my country becomes a democratic country. And so I have alliances with democratic countries throughout the world. And that has been the case under tyrannies throughout history. And I feel honored to play the role that I play. Thank you very much for your answer. So my question is very simple. So when we are concerned about human rights, rightly so, in Cuba, with the regime that's in place, because it is clear that the regime there right now is running roughshod over democratic freedoms, freedom of expression, freedom of association. But if we do that, and we do not denounce at the same time the U.S. embargo that's been there for 67 years as well, because that has an impact on the population directly as well. So we can't say one thing and not the other. So really, where I do not support what the regime is doing with regard to human rights in Cuba, but I also know that there are people that I know in Cuba that are suffering, and what concerns me is their health and their well-being, and the fact that they are undergoing a humanitarian crisis. Ms. Carbonell, could you maybe answer that? Shouldn't we also talk about the embargo if we're talking about the situation in Cuba because of the regime?
We could talk about the embargo. Thank you for the question, sorry. We should talk about the embargo. We could have maybe a different session altogether about the embargo. However, when we talk about the embargo, it is important to say the context of how it came about. And on top of that, more than that, it's important to say that that embargo can end tomorrow, should the regime wishes to do so. Therefore, we talk in Canada, we talk about the embargo. It's almost like a reflex that we go there. However, we never say that Canada created a law in the 70s whose only purpose is to circumvent the embargo. Cuba commercializes with the world. Why should we waste time talking about the external sanctions of another nation when the main issue is that we have a system in Cuba that does not allow for different political parties, does not allow to have free elections?
Mais en fait, l'idée c'est que
Yes, but the idea is that when the United States threatens a third country like Canada, Mexico, Spain, threatens a third country with sanctions, if it tries to send oil to Cuba, that's where I start asking questions. Because if there is a direct bilateral relationship like Canada has with Cuba, there should not be sanctions from another country like the United States right now when it comes to sending oil. So that's where I have a problem. And I would like to know what your position on that is, because it affects us, because the United States is threatening Canada if it sends fossil fuels to Cuba. So there is a problem there with the foreign policy of the United States towards Canada.
I would like to add, I understand, thank you for the question, and I understand where you're coming from. However, if you do your research a little bit further, for example, even today, U.S. administration is willing to have private companies in Cuba to import oil from the United States. The sanctions are targeting the regime. The sanctions do not target the population at the base. Like we have been talking this afternoon that U.S. has sent aid to Cuba. U.S. is distributing aid to the Cubans. U.S. is going a step further and is verifying, is making sure, like we have in Canada, we have the Financial Administration Act. There is no money in Canada, it gets encumbered, that we don't have traceability of the money. We keep our records for up to 6 years so we can go back and we can conduct audits. U.S. is doing that on the ground. So I understand the emphasis you're trying to make on the embargo. However, I am here to explain from the Cuban perspective that is the least of our worries because the embargo is targeting the Castro military totalitarian communist regime.
Donc, il n'y a aucun effet sur la population. Thank you.
So there's no effect on the population.
Rude, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you. Evidence has shown the Cuban regime has been reselling donated oil from Mexico and Venezuela on the black market while hoarding foreign currency, directly contributing to the fuel shortages that cause hospitals to shut down and families to live in darkness. How can Canada ensure that its humanitarian aid actually reaches the Cuban people instead of subsidizing a regime that creates its own shortages?
The question, and actually I will tie that a little bit with what Ms. Barrero was saying earlier. For example, there is record that on the commercial nautical zone, Cuba, the regime resells the oil that it was receiving from Venezuela at super fair market value. There is no question about it. 60% of the oil was not reaching Cuba. I grew up in a region, like I was saying, 3 kilometers from five-star hotels. My region never, ever got electricity ever. And they got electricity in 2014, and the town next to it, the village next to it, right now has no electricity. It has never been electrified. That's one thing. Second, she was talking about how the situation compares to Haiti. And I'll tell you this. I have colleagues in Canada who come from Haiti. Cuba is worse than Haiti, and I'll tell you why. It's true that we have a gang issue in the capital in Haiti, but the world is talking about it. And the world has put together a multinational brigade to go and help Haitian people to combat crime. But you know what? Farmers in Haiti are allowed to farm. Fishermen in Haiti are allowed to fish. Haiti has textile production. Haiti exports textile to the United States. Combat uniforms from the troops in the United States are made from Haiti, from textile from Haiti. Cubans, we have to go to Haiti. Well, not now because there is a situation with the flights, but in regular circumstances, we have to go to Haiti, and then they purchase in Haiti attire, and then they come back to Cuba and they resell it. So how Canada can ensure? Canada could very well be contributing in Operation Caribe. Canada, right now, U.S. is having Southern Spur operation. Canada, this is an example of where Canada can actually work hand in hand with the United States to keep the Caribbean safe. We have a partnership to make sure that the Arctic is safe. Canada has an Indo-Pacific policy. We have an Indo-Pacific strategy. Why we do not have a Caribbean strategy? Why we don't have a Latin American strategy? There are many things that Canada can do to help us.
So Canada does provide millions in aid and significant foreign direct investment and protects Canadian businesses in Cuba through the Foreign Extraterritorial Measures Act. Yet not a single Cuban official has ever faced Canadian sanctions for human rights abuses. Has Canada's constructive engagement failed the Cuban people for decades, and what specific changes must the Liberal government make to stop subsidizing repression?
Thank you for the question. It is hard to come to this commission and express that Canada bilateral relation with Cuba has failed the Cuban people, but this is what we feel. We feel that bilateral relations is there exactly to what you said, to provide support and consular support to tourists when they go to Cuba, and to provide support to the many Canadian companies that invest in Cuba. But I was saying earlier, right now, we, as the country, we are an enabler of a dictatorship. That dictatorship has not been in power for 67 years just because they're good at repressing, and they're good at having over 1,209 political prisoners, including prisoners like Jose Gabriel Barrenechea, who is an intellectual and whose mother was dying of cancer and was begging the regime to let her see her son one more time before passing away, and the regime declined. So therefore, yes, Canada should be applying Magnitsky sanctions to Cuban officials. We have the names of those judges who performed sham trials and summary trials, who put people in jail being innocent. We have the name of the Minister of the Interior. We have the name of the Castro family and their descendants who are exploiting the Cuban population. There is modern slavery in Cuba, like I was saying. And you know, the Canadian companies, there is record that Cuba has sent workers here, specialists here to Canada, as a rotation with the sheriff, and there is evidence. Evan Dyer from CBC had an article on it where Cuba was forcing those workers here in Canada to to wire the money, their salary, in accordance to Treasury Board. A specialist can make 6 digits here in Canada. The regime is forcing them to wire part of the salary back to Havana. So they not only have modern slavery within the confines of the territory, which Cuba is an island with a flag, and with many little prisons within it. I mean, Cuba is a prison island with a flag, with many, many little prisons within it, but also they put the borders wherever they want, and they have transnational aggression as well.
Thank you very much. We next go to MP Oliphant. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was on. I don't like the microphones in this room. They're harder for me to understand. I'm old-fashioned. Thank you to the witnesses for bringing your opinions, your ideas to us, and for your activism on behalf of Cuban people. Just want to reiterate about Canada's engagement recently, obviously, this week with the announcement of $8 million in humanitarian aid, which I'm very happy with and proud of. And it would seem to me we have 3 things in this conversation. One is the desire of Canadians to help the Cuban people. And so we start with essentials like food. And then we would go there in those basic issues like healthcare, education, housing, which also require fuel. Those are the things that Canadians have spoken to me the most about, and our government's response has been first in that way. The second issue that Canadians raise a lot are human rights issues, democratic institutions, reform of institutions, participation, equality, and equality, and those issues which they want Canada to foster and want us to invest in Cuba and elsewhere around the world. As a second kind of tier of engagement, the system of government is not Canada's priority. And we recognize that there are systems of government around the world that we are very different from Canadian government. And so we do not engage in either indirect or direct regime change. That is for the Cuban people who live in Cuba to decide. That is not for us to do, nor do I believe that it is for expats living around the world to do. We have a certain safety and security living in Canada. So we do not believe in regime change. It's the indirect regime change that we're also concerned about. So we received a letter, and I checked with the clerk to make sure that I could acknowledge a letter which I've received, we as a committee have received today, from the Americas Policy Group and Common Frontiers, which are actually very clear that they are wanting Canada to stand up against the American, not only the tradition of an embargo, but the more recent coercive activity of starving the country of fuel. And so this is their goal. And so the question I would have for the witnesses is, do they believe that the coercive activities of some countries, including the United States with its embargo, have actually helped change the regime, which has been their stated goal? Because I've heard at least one witness sort of argue for more stringent activities such as that. have they been effective, and will they be effective in any sense?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, we would never come to Canada's government or commission to ask direct help for a regime change in Cuba. We are cognizant that the transition to a democratic island is the responsibility of us Cuban. And I would like to correct, if I may, is the responsibility of Cuban not only in Cuba. We have been on exile. There are over 3 million of us who have been forced out of the island, and there is a big number of us who are prohibited right now from debarking a plane in Cuba should we wish to buy a ticket and go to Cuba. So wherever we are is our responsibility. And we are working in creating alliances. We are working in holding bilateral engagement and multinational engagement with many, many governments, like Ms. Barrero was saying. We will be free. It's not a matter of reaching to other governments. What we would like Canada is to stop repping the regime, because the highlights that I made is that it's hard for us Cubans to liberate ourselves when we are against a tyrannical regime. We are against mainstream media who keeps portraying what's not going on the island, and we have democratic nations sending billions and billions of dollars decades after decades, so it's hard to liberate oneself like that. Like I was saying, July 11th, in over 49 cities in Cuba, hundreds of thousands of Cubans took to the street to pacifically demand. Some of them were demanding basic essentials, but some of them were demanding freedom and democracy, which is what we need. And how the regime responded to that, it deploys the armed forces. It shot Duvis Laurencio, and he lost his life. So we have a criminal regime that deploys the armed forces against the civilian population. So yes, we also beg the democracies to at least don't fund them. At least start by not funding them. Start by applying sanctions, why not?
So I think if we're agreed that it should be organic, peaceful change happening in Cuba, what fosters that? Because I don't believe embargoes or starving the people of Cuba of either food or fuel works. So what are your suggestions for positive things that can be done to help the Cuban people so that as they come out of this, and I would call it a crisis despite what we've heard today, because Cuban friends who live in Cuba have told me it's a crisis. We were told it wasn't a crisis.
It is dark
I
crisis.
think so. What can we do that can get us through the crisis to the point where the Cuban people can have self-determination for an improved future?
Very quick response,
Yes.
and then we'll turn to also Ms. Ferrer, and then we'll conclude.
Every time we get to speak about democracy, my face lights up. Well, first of all, I would like to highlight that the hunger in Cuba is not caused by the embargo. The regime decides to stock hotels with all side of nutrition, and the bodegas in Cuba are empty shelves. So I would not accept that the room walks out of here thinking that the hunger in Cuba and the extreme poverty is due to the embargo. It's not true. If they are able to secure a supply chain to stock the hotels, they can secure a supply chain to stock the bodega, but they're not interested. And then the second portion to your question, how could Canada assist us in a peaceful democratic transition? For example, Canada could vocally and overtly advocate for the release of the political prisoners. These are innocent people. These are mother, fathers, brothers who took to the street. If we see that the political prisoners that are innocent get released, it will give us an indication that the regime is open to other considerations. So we don't feel comfortable with the idea that we funnel assistance decade after decade and nothing changes on the island.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and we go to Ms. Barrero to conclude.
We are not asking Canada to help us take down the regime or even help us have democracy. We will achieve democracy in Cuba. Cuba will be free. Cubans will achieve this. Whether Canada wishes to assist or not, I want that to be very clear. I'll repeat. The embargo hasn't caused the hunger in Cuba. It's the regime. What we're asking Canada is not to help us. We will achieve freedom. But do not legitimize a repressive regime, corrupt, that for 70 years has stolen aid and said it's the victim of the embargo, but never taken on its responsibilities.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the witnesses for your appearance before the committee. We will now briefly suspend to prepare for the second panel. Briefly suspension. call this meeting back to order. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for the second hour of this meeting. From the Center for Free Cuba, John Suarez, Executive Director, welcome. And from the Cuban Observatory of Human Rights, Monsieur Cires, Director of Strategy. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we'll proceed to rounds of questions from colleagues. So I first invite Mr. Cires to give up to 5 minutes opening statement.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. According to our most recent study on the state of social rights in Cuba, 89% of the population lives in extreme poverty, and 7 out of 10 Cubans must forego at least one of the 3 daily meals. Amid recurring epidemics, only 3% of the population was able to obtain medicine from pharmacies within the public health system. Among the hardest hit sectors, older adults suffer in an especially cruel way the effects of the system. Many live in homes at risk of collapse, without stable access to potable water, and receive a monthly retirement pension so low that it barely allows them to buy a dozen eggs and little more. Among the most vulnerable are also the victims of state repression, especially the approximately 800 prisoners of conscience and their families, who suffer the added injustice of losing their freedom for calling for change or for exposing this situation of scarcity and misery that we are talking about today. Roberto Perez Fonseca is one of those prisoners, and his brother is a Canadian citizen. The causes of this tragedy are structural. We are not speaking of a temporary or circumstantial crisis, nor of exogenous roots. These are the natural consequences of a centrally planned economic model that concentrates most means of production in the hands of the state, fails to provide legal certainty to investments, and suffocates economic and social freedom. The deterioration of hospitals, the shortage of medical supplies, the collapse of buildings, the increase in blackouts, and the mountains of garbage in the streets now appearing in international media are the result and accumulation of decades of failed policies. For years, those in power have prioritized hotel construction and businesses controlled by a military-run conglomerate, Gaesa, instead of taking care of the people. These companies buy food from other countries and resell them at exorbitant prices in dollars, out of reach for most households. There are blackouts, but various investigations indicate that a significant portion of the subsidized oil, as was mentioned by those witnesses before me, that Venezuela sent to Cuba was allegedly resold to third countries instead of being used to alleviate the internal energy crisis. I would also like to mention here the labor model imposed in Cuba's foreign investment sector. The ambassador was the Minister of Investments, which systematically violates workers' rights and impoverishes them by prohibiting the direct hiring of personnel by the investing company. Instead, hiring must be channeled through state employment agencies that act as monopolistic intermediaries that only let them receive Cuban workers receive 10%. That's not progressive. The persistent and critical humanitarian reality in Cuba has been invisible for decades, except when, for political or ideological reasons, some use it to criticize other states, or during periods when aid from abroad appears as a kind of assistance, but it does not address the real cause. An honest approach is required. Therefore, we present 3 proposals in different areas. First, that Canada participates in a coordinated international response that promotes real economic and political opening, encouraging fundamental freedoms, private initiative, and respect for human rights. Only structural, not cosmetic change will allow the Cuban people to regain hope and build their own future. Second, that humanitarian support be delivered directly to the Cuban population with churches and civil society to ensure effective delivery. And third, that Canada, together with other countries, press Cuban authorities to reform the labor regime governing foreign investment, one that would be unacceptable in any Western country, including here. Finally, honorable members, we are facing the end of a historical cycle in Cuba. Either the decision is made to prolong the country's decline and with it the agony of the Cuban people, or to help find a reasonable, peaceful political solution to the current situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Suarez to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm here representing today the Center for a Free Cuba, which is also a member of the Assembly of the Cuban Resistance. A humanitarian crisis persists in Cuba, predating President Donald Trump's executive order of January 19, 2026, which imposed tariffs on nations supplying oil to Cuba directly or indirectly. Yesterday, the U.S. Treasury Department announced the administration's intention to allow energy companies to sell fuel to private enterprises in Cuba while maintaining strict sanctions on the Cuban government. Cuba has endured a permanent humanitarian crisis since 1961, driven by two main factors: the inefficiencies of its communist system and U.S. economic sanctions. The critical question is, which contributes primarily to the ongoing economic disaster? Prior to 1959's communist revolution, from 1952 to 1958, Cuba's food supply was highly productive, ranking third in Latin America for daily calorie consumption. This success stemmed from nationalistic policies promoting agricultural self-sufficiency to meet market demand. This ended under Fidel Castro's regime, which seized and collectivized properties, prohibiting farmers from selling crops to non-state entities. By 1964, the government's acopio system controlled all agricultural products, setting production quotas and requiring sales to the state. Cuba's recent agricultural law, Decreto Ley 358 of 2018, upholds these prohibitions on private sales. Food rationing began in 1962 as a control mechanism and persists today. Items are subsidized but insufficient to sustain individuals. As Reuters journalist Mark Frank reported in 2010, Cuba's centralized system forces farmers to sell fixed crops to the state in exchange for supplies, often leading to rotting crops and shortages of inputs like feed, pesticides, and fertilizer. These inefficiencies, unrelated to sanctions, stem from the absence of market mechanisms. Media outlets like Diario de Cuba on March 18th of 2021 and 14 y Medio June 15th, 2021 document rotting tomatoes, onions, and vegetables due to Acopio's delays in collection. Farmers face fines, detentions, or imprisonment for attempting independent sales. Consequently, Cuba imports 70 to 80% of its food, even during periods of heavy Soviet subsidies or Venezuelan aid. For example, between 2011 and 2014, with no fuel shortages, rationing continued unabated. Since 2000, much of this food has come from the U.S. In 2025, Cuba imported $810.8 million in U.S. goods. Today, Cuban chicken primarily originates from Alabama and Mississippi. Per the Observatory of Economic Complexity, in 2024, Cuba's poultry imports were led by the United States, $298 million, followed by Brazil, $39 million, Netherlands, $21 million, Poland, $9.67 million, and Paraguay, $510,000. The nation subjected to comprehensive multilateral sanctions by the United States and much of the world was apartheid South Africa. Experts note that despite targeting agricultural products against South Africa, doesn't happen with Cuba, these sanctions had minimal impact on the regime's food supply, as South Africa, like Cuba, effectively circumvented the restrictions. The same cannot be said for the devastating effects of communist economic planning on food security. The 20th century's greatest famine stemmed from communist forced collectivization. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's policies led to the 1932-1933 Holodomor in Ukraine, where grain seizures for export caused 6 to 10 million deaths. In China, Mao Zedong's 1959-1961 Great Leap Forward resulted in over 30 million starving, even as China exported food to Cuba at the time. Cuba's humanitarian crisis arises not from unilateral U.S. sanctions, but from Havana's adherence to this failed model. Since 2022, the Center for a Free Cuba has urged the international community to establish a humanitarian corridor delivering aid directly to Cubans in need, bypassing the kleptocratic Havana regime. In February 2026, the State Department announced an additional $6 million in humanitarian aid to Cuba, building on $3 million successfully delivered in January to the Catholic Church's Caritas organization. Testimonies confirmed the initial aid reached victims directly, bringing the total U.S. distribution to $9 million. The Center also endorses the appeal by Human Rights Action Group and Democratic Spaces, both Canadian NGOs, calling on Canada to press Havana to legalize independent civil society for effective aid distribution. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And before I pass the floor to questions, I want to take the opportunity on behalf of colleagues to sincerely thank you both for traveling from the United States and from Panama to Ottawa to appear before us and before this committee. I appreciate that very much, and we all do. So I'm going now to questions from colleagues, beginning with MP Rood. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being here with us today. And it's interesting some of the things, Mr. Suarez, sorry, I'm not very good at Spanish, but it's interesting some of the things you said. I've seen some of those things in this country at one point, and some of those things lifted off of farmers in this country. And I'm wondering, while the Canadian government provides humanitarian aid to Cubans, it continues to allow the Cuban regime's state propaganda channel, the Cuba Vision Internacional, which rebroadcasts Russian state media, to operate on Canadian airwaves even after formal complaints to the CRTC went unanswered. So in your view, how does permitting this propaganda help the Cuban regime hide the true causes of the humanitarian crisis from Canadians and the world?
Well, the Cuban government is a failure in practically everything except in two areas. Its capacity to repress, its secret police and espionage, not only in Cuba but outside of Cuba and Western nations, and secondly, in its propaganda. And those propaganda channels are very effective in portraying the Cuban regime as a victim, and obviously having those channels here in Canada is something that benefits their efforts to shape public opinion.
Thank you very much. With Gaeza's massive hidden reserves exposed, the regime can no longer credibly claim that it lacks resources to fix blackouts or buy medicine. So how can Canada use this evidence to demand real democratic reforms, including fair and free and multi-party elections, release all of political prisoners, and legalization of independent civil society before providing any further assistance?
Well, I think what Canada could do is to call for accountability and transparency in terms of the aid getting on the ground. We have networks, we have access to networks of Cubans that have provided feedback to us following Hurricane Melissa in October. We know that Europe and Canada sent millions in aid, but the only aid that those folks in the east of Cuba received who had been heavily impacted was in January and February from aid provided by the United States. So I do think that having diplomats on the ground, they're able to push to make sure that the aid does get to the people in need, the people whose homes have been destroyed, people that are living without roofs, that they're seeing that basic aid, food and other basic necessities, arrive when Canadian assistance goes there. And the problem is these UN agencies, as was said earlier, collaborate with Cuban gongos, not NGOs. And gongos are governmental, non-governmental organizations, an Orwellian term, like the Federación de Mujeres Cubanos, the Union of Young Communists. They're tied to the Cuban government. They follow orders from the Council of State and from the Castro family. They're not independent operators operating in good faith on the ground. So I think providing that the Caritas, which is a church-connected charity that has demonstrated the ability to get aid across the island to people in need, is one way to do it. The other one, as Democratic Spaces has requested, is to push for civil society to be able to also provide that aid across the island, actual civil society, not the gongos.
Thank you. Canada has imposed targeted sanctions on officials in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Russia, and China for far less than Cuba's documented record of torture, arbitrary detention, and export of repression across the Americas. Why has Canada given the Cuban dictatorship a free pass, and what targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions should Canada impose right now on regime officials responsible for the humanitarian crises and suffering?
I'd like to first say that I'm grateful to Canada at the UN Human Rights Commission, UN Human Rights Council. They have taken a strong position in defense of human rights in Cuba. In terms of Magnitsky sanctions, I think individuals like Raul Castro, who directly participated in the extrajudicial killings of Cuban Americans with the Brothers to the Rescue shootdown, which was 30 years ago this past week, the murder of Osvaldo Payar Sardinas, who was a human rights defender who organized a petition drive in which tens of thousands of Cubans signed, called the Varela Project. He was recognized by the European Union with the Sakharov Prize. He was murdered. The Inter-American Commission for Human Rights confirmed it in a report that came out in June of 2023 that he was murdered by agents of the Cuban government. I think those actions alone justify placing Magnitsky sanctions on Raul Castro and people in the hierarchy of the chain of command that executed those type of criminal actions.
If Canada is serious about alleviating the humanitarian crisis in Cuba, should it shift from quiet humanitarian gestures to a principled policy that includes public condemnation of repression, targeted sanctions on officials responsible for abuses, and direct, consistent engagement with independent civil society, the same approach we use with other authoritarian regimes?
Absolutely. And we have seen it in the past. From 1996 to approximately 2016, the European Union, with their common agreement, had a much more robust human rights-focused policy. Unfortunately, when the U.S. did its FAAE with Havana, that policy was shifted. That was one focused more on dealing with economic development, but not with a human rights focus. And I think that that was harmful for the pro-democracy movement in the island and also encouraged the dictatorship to be more repressive since then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. We next go to MP Guilbeault. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much to our witnesses to have traveled here to appear in front of us. It's greatly appreciated. So I guess coming back on something you said earlier, Mr. Suarez, I think most of us would agree that what we're seeing in Cuba is the result of a number of factors, certainly including a regime that has failed to provide what it should have provided to its population, and that has been exacerbated by U.S. sanctions that have been in place for decades, and more specifically, those that have been in place for over the last few weeks. What I think some of us are trying to understand, and I think we've heard at great lengths from different witnesses today, the recommendation in terms of regime change and what should be done in relation to the government of Cuba. I'm wondering if the witnesses that are here can provide us with some understanding, recommendation in terms of, is there anything they feel that should be done in terms of the U.S. sanctions themselves?
Sure. Well, I think one of the things that I mentioned in my presentation is, I think to a large degree, there are two concrete things that have occurred. One is that I don't think the sanctions, the sanctions, especially post-1961, the agenda has not been regime change. What it has been a policy of containment. And what we've seen paradoxically is the sanctions policy has not been static. There have been times, the Carter administration, for example, actually lifted the travel embargo completely and loosened economic sanctions, and there was an attempt there to normalize relations. Those increased resources resulted in Cuba's adventurism in Central America, the creation of Daniel Ortega's Sandinista regime, which is now butchering large numbers of students and repressing religious figures as a direct result of the actions of the Cuban government. During the Clinton administration in the 90s, it was another effort to loosen sanctions, improve relations Under Bill Clinton, the United States began joint military exercises on the Guantanamo Naval Base between Cuba and the United States. The result of that was we saw massacres of Cuban families in the 13 de Marzo tugboat sinking of July 13th of 1994, and the shoot down of the Brothers to the Rescue planes on February 24th of 1996. This was a humanitarian organization that saved approximately 4,200 lives of Cuban refugees in the Florida Straits between 1991 and 1996. The Cuban dictatorship could not tolerate them because in addition to that, they were also doing outreach with the Martin Luther King Center out of Atlanta and also encouraging and teaching people about civil disobedience and nonviolence and also having relations with dissidents inside of the island. But that led to the codification of the embargo in 1996. So the reason the embargo now is a much more difficult thing to get lifted was because of an act of state terrorism committed by Cuba on February 24th of 1996. But despite that, when the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. opened up cash and carry trade with Cuba in 2000. And that's why this past year, the United States sold over $800 million in agricultural goods to Cuba. So the issue is the sanctions, what they've done is, the idea is to deny resources to Cuba's repressive apparatus inside the island, but also for them to be engaging in their adventurism abroad in places like Venezuela, Nicaragua. And we've seen where loosening sanctions has actually provided them with more resources, more legitimacy to be more aggressive internationally. While it's been tightened, they've been more on the defensive as they are now and more willing to negotiate, including negotiate openings on the economic front internally.
Gracias por la pregunta, honorable.
Thank you for your question. I think that the international responsibility to protect human rights cannot be set aside under the pretext of the U.S. sanctions or the relationship between the United States and Cuba. There's an international responsibility, and Canada should feel part of that responsibility. There is also a responsibility on the part of the Cuban regime when it comes to finding solutions to the Cuban people's problems, including in the context of its relationship with the United States government, because the Cuban people are under their peoples, rather, in other regions like Taiwan that are under an incredible threat, and they still ensure a certain standard of living for the people. So really, it is quite an anomaly to really take the view that everything is due to a relationship with a major power.
And share your perspective on the issue of human rights violation in Cuba by the regime. But as my colleague Rob and Alexis have said earlier, for some of us, we cannot overlook the human rights violation that are a result of the U.S. sanctions, violations of international laws, of UN Charter. So I think for many of us, these two things are linked together and are difficult to separate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We next go to Monsieur Duceppe. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Mr. Duceppe, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I just want to reassure you, yes, and I have sanctions against me from China and Russia, so I am not a big fan of authoritarian regimes, and authoritarian regimes don't like me either. So when it comes to human rights, I have a position that is very easy to check, and that is what I am interested in right now. And I think that the current crisis, well, some are telling us that it's directly linked to Trump's decision on January 29th. So there are a number of people and reports that are telling us that since Trump's decision, we can see that that is what triggered the humanitarian crisis that we see in Cuba right now. Was it exponentially amplified by the decisions of the regime in Cuba? Well, that's something else. But what I am interested in is to be able to help the Cuban people. That is why you're here today, to tell us how we can ensure that the humanitarian crisis is resolved as quickly as possible. And then, if you don't agree with the ideals of one regime, that's one thing, but letting people suffer is another.
I think one of the things we've been calling for since 2022 is an international humanitarian corridor. It can be something de facto or something pursued through the United Nations, which would basically call on the Cuban government to allow for because they have legislation in the book that says that they have to have a role in whatever aid is distributed. But I think, as we've seen with the case of the United States in January, the pressure of the U.S. diplomatically with Havana has allowed U.S. aid to go directly to the Cubans on the ground. Now, if the United States, which is the enemy of Cuba, which has all these policies that are so incredibly hostile, is able to provide humanitarian assistance directly to the average Cuban on the ground, why can't Canada do that? Why won't Havana permit Canada to provide humanitarian assistance to those Cubans that have their homes ripped off, that haven't had assistance come in, not only for Hurricane Melissa, but for the previous hurricanes? And they're still without a roof, without housing, and they haven't seen the assistance from either the European Union or Canada. What we've heard is that these people in the east of Cuba, what they have seen in terms of assistance for the first time was in January and February from the United States. So my question would be, and I think this would accelerate assistance to the average Cuban, is for the Europeans and the Canadians and other people of goodwill to pressure the Cuban government to permit them and perhaps European NGOs, Canadian NGOs, if they don't want to use actual independent Cuban NGOs, to go in and provide the assistance to Cuban people on the ground immediately.
OK. Il y a deux choses.
Okay, yes, no, go ahead. So maybe there's two things in what you just said. First, I thought that going through the World Food Program and UNICEF gave us a certain guarantee of getting reports from those two organizations because they have global expertise when it comes to deploying humanitarian aid. And what we're hearing from certain witnesses is that that's a good thing, and other witnesses are saying that that's not a good idea. So we'll have to decide on that in our committee. But with regard to the first question that I asked, did Trump's decision on January 29th have an impact on the crisis that is taking place in Cuba right now? And it seems that nobody really wants to answer that simple question, in my opinion.
The situation, obviously, I believe that the situation of cutting off fuel entering the country has to have had a negative impact. However, what has been featured in the press of the piles of garbage and the humanitarian catastrophe, that did not start in January. That has been going on for years. In 2015, Moscow offered Havana $1.5 billion to help rebuild Cuba's electrical power grid. They had to come up with 10%. The response of the Cuban government to Moscow was, we have other priorities. Their other priorities, as we've heard earlier, is building high-rise luxury hotels that have their own generators. And you can see the photographs, if you search through the internet, of entire towns that are dark from lack of electricity, except for the luxury hotel built by the military that has its own generator. That is the reality. In July of 2021, there were mass protests in Cuba, one for the desire of people for freedom, but the other thing was you had a propaganda apparatus that was claiming that they were going to develop their own sovereign vaccines, while at the same time, there were no vaccines being distributed in Cuba, although the Russian and Chinese vaccines were being distributed through the rest of Latin America, in addition to Moderna and Pfizer. And the Cubans were losing their family members who were being buried in mass graves. And then the propaganda, the happy talk was how they're going to have, in a short while, these sovereign vaccines. The Cubans that was one of the factors that frustrated the Cubans to take to the streets. And then in August of 2021, the regime responded by allowing the Chinese COVID vaccine into the island. But that took hundreds of thousands of Cubans taking to the streets, who they fired upon. And there's still over 1,200 political prisoners in Cuba, many of them that were engaged in those protests, and others who are farmers that are trying to provide their produce to Cubans on the ground. The Cubans would rather import it from the United States than to allow the Cuban farmers to generate the food for the Cuban people.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Majumdar. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. And thank you as well for your citation of the Human Rights Action Group and Democratic Spaces report. I used to be a board member of the Human Rights Action Group, and it was an impeccable report written by some great Canadians with some strong recommendations calling for policy coherence, among other things. Let me pick up a little bit on where my colleague from the bloc started with, because I think it's an important thread to pull on. What do you make the power grid crisis? It's a decaying infrastructure, deferred maintenance, fuel shortages, economic mismanagement in which they, to your point, sir, Mr. Suarez, you see the regime prioritizing tourism and the military installations over their people that have resulted in blackouts, water, and fraud. It's the regime that's responsible for this collapse of the power grid, is it not?
The other priority they have is spreading the revolution to other countries, like Venezuela, like Nicaragua. Because what happens when they take over, they set up a neo-colonial structure in which then they're able to suck the resources out of those countries and enrich their elites. The regime is a kleptocracy. The reports provided by Nora Games-Torres, a Miami Herald reporter, she had some documents that were leaked from within the regime, which indicated, as was mentioned earlier, that Gaesa, the Cuban military conglomerate, is sitting on $18 billion in cash reserves. This is at a time when Cubans are dying of easily treatable diseases if the Cuban government would invest in $400 million in the purchase of medicines that would help Cubans today. And they're sitting on $18 billion. It's an outrage.
It's an outrage that not only that they have picked up $18 billion in reserves that should be servicing the Cuban people, but also Cuba has become a locus for authoritarians, as you said. It's a hub of trafficking for the Russian military to continue its invasion of Ukraine. They've partnered with China in surveillance technology and is a declared partner of the Belt and Road Initiative. They've partnered with Venezuelan repression, as you've described here. Would you say that Havana was responsible for spreading the ideology in the Americas, as opposed to the narco-trafficking regime of Venezuela?
If you go back to 1960, October, there's a documented transcription of a meeting of Ernesto Che Guevara with Mao Zedong, where they outline the weaknesses in the Americas and what countries were targets of opportunity. And as I also mentioned in my comments, what's interesting, in that period of time, when the U.S. still had normal relations with Cuba, they were already plotting out the communist takeover in the Americas, in different countries. They were also looking at, I mean, it's shocking to me, you had tens of millions of Chinese going hungry because of the Great Leap Forward, and for propaganda purposes, they were shipping food to Cuba at a time when Cuba did not need it, to compete with the Soviets as to who would be more helpful to the Cuban communist model.
Incredible. Now, finally, if I might, in the brief time I have left, you described how the U.S. government, ostensibly the greatest rival to Havana, has been able to provide aid on the ground through USAID and other partners. You recommended Caritas, the church network, the legalization of more civil society. These are all important things. Now, according to some accounts, including the Patriotic Union of Cuba, the last time that this organization in Cuba had any engagement with the Embassy of Canada was during the Harper government over 12 years ago. Not since then has there been any systemic approach to engage Cuban civil society by the government. What's your assessment of that?
My assessment is, tragically, when the United States abandoned the Democrats during the Obama thaw and went from democracy promotion to economic engagement with what they would term los emprendedores, the rest of the world followed. The Europeans disengaged the human rights component from their PDCA with Cuba, and apparently, I just heard about this recently, Canada did as well. They were following the lead of Washington, and it was tragic.
You know, at the time, you had the Google CEO arriving in Havana alongside entreaties by America, and you saw the switch happen, and the pressure came off the regime, and all of a sudden, for a decade, you saw a regime take the welfare benefits of international multilateral efforts to strengthen itself and spawn even more instability across the region. I thank you for your testimony. I think my time is up.
Okay, thank you very much. We go next to MP Van der Bell. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. I'd like to direct my first question to Mr. Siris. I really appreciate, and I think all of us agree that we want to see a Cuba where, first of all, the humanitarian disaster that is happening right now is alleviated for the people, and that there is self-determination and democracy and respect for human rights and rule of law. I don't think anyone here disagrees with that. I'd like to go through some of the things that you suggested because I'm very interested to hear more. First of all, about the humanitarian corridors and how we can get the aid directly to those civil society groups that you mentioned. I would note that actually Canada does and has for a long time supported Caritas and in Cuba and a number of civil society groups. You mentioned also diplomatic, having diplomats who are on the ground be there to do those verifications, to be able to do that accountability, but also, of course, the accountability that exists through UN systems. And the other thing that I wanted to just ask, and I'll ask both of you to answer, but starting, of course, with Mr. Siris, is that in the past, I know there's a tremendous desire by Canadians to support Cuban people, and there's a lot of people-to-people ties with Canada. We have in the past had matching funds where certain trusted civil society organizations in Canada that were raising funds with those partnerships, any dollar raised by them would be matched by the Canadian government. So basically effectively doubling it, but encouraging public participation. I wonder if you think that would be a suitable option in this case as well. So Mr. Siris, and then we'll go to Mr. Suarez. Go ahead.
But he's supposed to go first, I believe.
No, primero tú.
Yeah, Mr. Siris first, please.
Okay,
yeah.
Bueno, sí.
Yes. I think it would be good to have that mechanism. We can't criminalize international cooperation. The UN itself, there are resolutions on that. That's why it's shocking when there are accusations against an organization for receiving international funding. I think it would be a good mechanism. But not just that. We also want independent civil society to be recognized, including in exile, as a valid stakeholder, interlocutor. So that's what's happened at this committee. It's very positive because in many places it's been claimed that the opposition, democratic and civil society have been set aside.
I would like to first say something that sort of got by me, which is I think it's also critical that Canada and other democracies around the world, or the middle powers, as Prime Minister Carney mentioned in his recent speech, push the Cubans on the issue of allowing the International Committee of the Red Cross to enter Cuba's prisons. The last time they were able to visit Cuba's prisons was in 1989. Let us contrast this with the prison at the U.S. base in Guantanamo. They've had over 100 visits of the International Committee of the Red Cross since 2002. So Cuban prisoners, and we know of cases, there was a protest due to the horrible conditions in the prisons in Canaleta. We've heard that between 8 and 10 have been killed just in the last few days, but there's no monitoring by the International Committee of the Red Cross, no independent monitoring, and that's an outrage. And I don't think it's been normalized, and I don't think it should be. Now, on the issue of the matching funds, I think that's a great idea. However, I think, like with any other funds, we need to see the end result. There has to be some sort of accountability, some transparency to see if it's actually getting to Cubans in need on the ground. And that's where I think a very active Canadian embassy presence there to monitor, to make sure that what these NGOs are doing in Canada to get assistance with matching taxpayer funds into Cuba actually reaches the people who need it and it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that, Canada has had long-standing diplomatic relations with Cuba, and so that relationship is something that we could certainly use. I don't want to use the word leverage, but we can use some of the relationship and the aid to be able to push for those to assist Cuban people who are looking for the kinds of reforms. I wonder again. I would like to go back to Mr. Sears. The idea of the humanitarian corridors. You mentioned some of that and the role of diplomats. If you might be able to expand a little bit on exactly how that would work, because I'm not entirely clear what you mean by those corridors. Is it a physical thing? Is it how exactly would that work?
So very brief response because we're over time.
I believe I was the one who brought up the humanitarian corridor. What I've understood is that through UN mechanisms, there are, you can set up a humanitarian corridor and an arrangement with the host country and get that assistance directly in. It would be a vote that would be taken at the UN to do that, or you could do it de facto, which is what we've seen with the United States over the last couple of months.
Thank you very much. We get next, Monsieur Député Duceppe.
Mr. Duceppe, you have 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the recommendation to put pressure to have the Red Cross have access to prisoners and prisons in Cuba. I think that's something we'll all look at together in the report for this study. Earlier, you talked about Mao Zedong and Che Guevara. The 50s to the 90s, we could have also talked about South American dictatorship supported by the Americans, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, etc., the Condor Operation. So it was the Cold War, and there are people who suffered under great powers. There's one thing I have a hard time understanding the answers I've had today from different witnesses who've said specifically that the American embargo currently has no consequence on the Cuban people and that the oil blockade of January 29th has no consequence on the people of Cuba. The people who came here today, are they saying that it's a good thing, the embargo, that it's a good thing to have the energy blockade vis-a-vis the suffering of the Cuban people? What I say is that the grave situation in Cuba is not explained based on that phenomenon, the embargo. There are structural causes that predate it. I have the view that now we're talking more about the crisis, but it's because of the latest measures from the North American government. And before, what happened is it was denied because what was convenient to the Cuban regime before and to different international perspectives was to sell Cuba as an idyll, a model on earth, paradise on earth. But not long ago, President Petro proposed the Cuban model for healthcare and education. It's crazy. It's not about denying or not. The situation currently is not explained just by the embargo. There are structural causes that have been explained and the priorities of the Cuban elite.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're out of time. We're going to go next to MP Cobena. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Suarez, we had as a witness the Cuban ambassador at this committee, and I'd like to share a quote from him and would like to get your thoughts on it. And I quote, "The issue of human rights has traditionally been manipulated against Cuba. In Cuba, no one is in prison for their beliefs, but for breaking the law. No one is in jail without having been tried following due process. Many of them, so-called political prisoners, have confessed to being paid agents in the service of a superpower that seeks to destroy the Cuban order."
Refer to Amnesty International's recent reports, which describes Cuba's new penal code, which was imposed in 2022 as draconian, totalitarian. It criminalizes dissent. So technically, yes, you could say that it's people have broken the law, but there are laws that bar people from being able to express themselves freely. Therefore, the penal code is, it criminalizes dissent, and to a certain degree, it criminalizes thought, because they have this term, peligrosidad social predelictiva. Now they've changed it to a new term, but it's basically that potentially in the future, based on your social class or your ideas, you may be a problem, so they can lock you up for 4 years in prison. And there are thousands, there was a judge who defected a few years ago, and he provided some documentation indicating that there are thousands of people a year being processed under that law, but these aren't even people that are dissidents. These are people that are potential dissidents that are jailed. And I'm sure that Yaxis would like to say something about that as well.
Bueno, régimen.
The Cuban regime in recent years has adopted repressive norms, a new penal code which makes repression even more sophisticated. And there are a number of evocative examples. Recently, it was announced that a young person was sentenced for criticizing the regime on Facebook. And another one was sentenced to 5 years, a friend of his, just for sharing that critique. It's a difficult situation. Over 800 political prisoners. These are violations of human rights. If they're not, what would they be?
Father and daughter case. Felix Navarro and Saily Navarro. Felix Navarro was a university professor. He was locked up in 2003 for engaging in the Project Varela petition drive. His daughter joined the Ladies in White, which was an initiative by mothers, sisters, daughters to free their loved ones. So she became politically active. In 2021, when the protest occurred in Cuba, father and daughter went to the local prison to check on activists that had been detained. Because of that, they're currently in prison today. Both are Amnesty International prisoners of conscience. Felix is over 70 years old and in poor health and very concerned about what may happen to him.
Thank you for that. In 2021, thousands of Cubans took to the streets under the banner of Patria y Vida, calling for dignity, economic opportunity, and basic freedoms. The response was mass arrests, reports of police violence, and lengthy prison sentences. And as we sit here today, could you speak to how many Cubans remain in prison for participating in those protests?
So I just want to point out, and maybe the member can help me, how this connects to the humanitarian situation and the consular issues.
Human rights. We're talking about human rights.
Absolutely. No,
right?
we're talking about humanitarian situation, and as long as you can connect it to the topic, I'm happy to entertain the question. But
today,
the more we veer away from the topic, then it becomes harder, right?
So as of today,
I'm happy to be understanding, but just make a connection to the humanitarian situation or consular issues. Thank you.
Well, some of the political prisoners are in the worst humanitarian crisis. Okay.
Make that
so
connection. That's all I'm asking.
Thank you. So as we sit here today, how many Cubans remain in prison for participating in those protests or for expressing dissent?
Several hundred are still from 2021. There have been other protests that have taken place. There are over 1,200 that we know of. These are partial numbers because there are no independent actors, such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, to visit the prisons and be able to substantiate that. But those are the numbers provided by family members and others that are able to substantiate that number. I also want to mention, you mentioned Patria y Vida. One of the authors, Michael Castillo, is also in extremely poor health. He's a prisoner of conscience. He's in prison today. Another individual who appears in the video is Luis Manuel Otero Alcantara. He was one of the 100 most influential people according to Time magazine. He was arrested trying to walk out of his home on July 11th of 2021. He's also suffering in a Cuban prison today.
I would like to ask you a question. The Cuban ambassador recently stated at this committee that Cuba is mainly the victim of the U.S. blockade, and that is one of the central reasons for the humanitarian crisis in the country. Could you tell us what you think about that?
Thanks.
No.
Yes, the real victims of the current situation is the Cuban people, and they're not victims of the U.S. embargo. It's almost 70 years of failed policies and the wrong priorities that give priority to the interests of the military and of a particular family. And we've shown that here today. Well, obviously, the ambassador has to defend his policies, but the evidence shows otherwise.
Finally, last to MP Oliphant. Okay, thank you. Based on that, I want to thank, on behalf of all our colleagues, thank you both for your appearance before the committee. Our next meeting will be on March 10th regarding the situation in Venezuela. Is it the will of the committee to adjourn the meeting? Thank you. Adjourn.